It is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, John Higginson. He is the CTO of Innova International, which is a Chicago-based financial technology company that happens to be one of our gold sponsors today. I have the pleasure to work with John every day, and a couple of things that I've noticed about him is he's a great advocate for diversity at Innova, and he's a good storyteller. Before Innova, John was the CTO at highly profitable companies such as Wheels Incorporated, FTD Companies Incorporated, and Applied Systems Incorporated. So please join me in giving him a great welcome.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello, everybody. So I'm so honored to be here today. This, as David mentioned in the opening video, this began as a what if last year. What if we could bring together a conference of women and allies and talk about building that community in Chicago? Last year was really cool. This year has been phenomenal. And for that, the credit goes to Innova's Women in Technology group. So can I have the Women in Tech group stand? Let's stand up. So I am so incredibly proud of the work that all of you have done to put this together. This is a phenomenal event. I know you worked very hard at it, and it's great. Thank you very much. So I want to tell you the story of my life. And along the way, I will share with you 3 lessons and 3 confessions that hopefully we'll talk about and take you through my journey with diversity. So, yeah, this is me. This was me when I was a freshman in college, my dorm room. This was the 80s, and we'll talk quite a bit about the 80s today. So, I look like I'm about to drop the biggest Tears for Fears album of the decade in this shot. Fashion has moved on. So, when I look back at my life, I realized that 3 things shaped who I am today. So one is certainly computers. I have a first and enduring love of technology. I wouldn't be here today if not for that early spark in that computer and thinking about how technology could actually transform things. It's also books. It's also ideas. Because very much my childhood and beyond is, the animation's still in there, how about that? Has been shaped by books and ideas. And the third thing is that I was raised by a single mother. Now, here's where I'll give you my first confession. This actually isn't my story. This is my mom's story. So, this is my mom. This is my mom on her wedding day in 1961. I know what you're thinking, how tragic it is he looks like his dad. But these are the cards we were dealt. Not long after I was born, my mom decided that she wanted to do a little redecorating. And so she began to work part-time, and she wanted to save for a pink velvet couch. This is, keep in mind, these are the days before IKEA. So she went to work part-time at this place called Gino's Steakhouse. It was a local restaurant. She worked 2 days a week. But about 6 months after my mom began working at Gino's Steakhouse, my dad left. And at 31 years old, my mom found herself the sole earner, a single mother, and a 4-year-old child to raise. So my mom went to work at the restaurant full-time. And these are pictures of her as she progressed and worked at the restaurant. One thing you'll notice about my mom and the photos that I use in this talk is that the hair remains constant. It was this high her entire life. Now, my mom had a really interesting journey. She started as a hostess at the restaurant, part-time. And she worked her way up. She began to work full-time. She became a manager of the hostesses and then a manager of more parts of the restaurant. And ultimately, she became the general manager of the entire restaurant. So yes, my mom became boss lady. So my mom, though, this was a very unique thing, because back then, my mom wasn't just in rare company running a restaurant. My mom was a unicorn. Because back then, if you talked about people who ran restaurants or restaurant owners, this is what they looked like. They weren't women, they were all men. They were all white men, by the way. So my mom was in a very, very unique position. And, you know, my mom, in the 80s, so this is just to give you a sense of what this decade was like, my mom was working in an environment that looked like this. At the beginning of the 1980s, 15% of all lawyers were women. There were 22 women in Congress. That's out of 535, if you remember your history. And there were 0. There wasn't a single woman, in 1980, there wasn't a single woman in the Fortune 100 C-suite. Not one. So this is the environment she came into. She was very unique. And I learned a lot from being with her. So I want all of you to imagine for a moment the most demanding, difficult, blunt, pain in the ass boss that you've ever had. And please, Innovatech people, don't look at me. That was my mom. And I worked for her for 6 years at the restaurant when I was in high school and early in college. And my mom was really hard on me. She gave me all the worst jobs in the restaurant, the longest hours, the most difficult things to do, because she was going to make very sure that the boss's kid didn't have any special treatment. And I like to think of that as lesson number 0. But I want to share with you 3 things that I saw from working with my mom and watching her interact in this world that have taught me some things about diversity. So I'll tell you 3 stories. The first story I like to refer to as the Australian and the Amex card. So back in the 80s, we didn't have this, newfangled thing called computers, right? We had paper, a lot of paper, and we had phone calls. So if you went to a restaurant and you charged something, they would take a paper copy of your card, and occasionally they would call the card company and they would validate whether or not the card was good or they could accept it. So one time, an Australian businessman came in with a fairly large group of people and had a dinner, fairly expensive, and whipped out his American Express card. Now, because it was a large bill, the hostess decided to call the card company and make sure it was okay. And the card company was a little concerned because, the card was issued in Australia, it's a large amount of money, he hadn't charged anything else, and so they said, we're declining the card. So this gentleman was not happy, as you might imagine, and went through talking to the waiter, the hostess, and finally got to my mom. Because he asked the hostess, can you give me the person in charge? And so my mom rolls up. And he looked at my mom, and he looked back at the hostess and said, no, the person in charge. And my mom said, that's me. And so they argued for a good 20 minutes. I actually was standing there. I was actually in the dining room watching this. And after about 20 minutes, he realized 2 things. One is that he was going to have to pay someone away. He was stuck. And the other was that my mom really was in charge. This really was the person who was going to have the final say about that. The second story that I'll tell you is the tableless alderman. So Gino's was it was a fine dining restaurant. It was a fairly popular destination. And people would come in from all over the Chicago area, including politicians. And an alderman came in one time. I won't name him, he's actually still with us. He came in one time and he wanted not only a table, but he wanted a specific table. And he came in on a weekend, it was pretty busy. And he asked again, he asked the hostess, no, I want that table in the back by the wine rack, and can you put me over there? Sorry, sir, I can't, the table's already given to somebody, we have somebody right after that. And so my mom walked over and started to talk to him and said, I'm sorry, Mr. Alderman, we can't give you the table that you've asked for, but we can certainly accommodate you somewhere else. And he sighed, and he was looking around, and at that moment, one of the maitre d's came up. His name was Steve. He's an older gentleman, worked there for many, many years. But he came up, he was wearing a sport coat, he was wearing a tie, and so the alderman's like, great. Now the person who can fix this for me, the man is here. He can fix this for me. So he turned to Steve and he says, can you just tell her to give me the table I want? And Steve looked at him and looked at my mom and smiled and he said, I can't. I work for her. So he didn't get his table. The last story I'll tell you is about a woman that worked for my mom by the name of Eve. So Eve, and this is Eve, if you want to see her, this is her at the front desk in the restaurant. Eve had started working there, and then she became pregnant with her first child. She worked through her first trimester, and then in her second trimester, she began to show. And because of the way the restaurant worked, there were 4 other hostesses, they were all women, and because of the way the restaurant worked, everybody worked on Fridays and Saturdays. They were the busiest days of the week for the restaurant. And when Eve began to show in her second trimester, customers, male customers, began to complain about a pregnant woman working. Because as a hostess, you have to be at the desk, you have to walk customers all over the restaurant and drop them off. And back then, some of the thinking was that if you were pregnant, it was an affliction, and you could never be far from your fainting couch. Because you just couldn't do that. So there was another reason, though, that was known, but probably went unstated. And that was that the hostesses were eye candy. Yeah, that was that era. And my mom knew both of those things. Now the owner, being very customer focused, as you would imagine an owner of a restaurant being, went to my mom and said, I need you to cut down Eve's days, take her off the weekends, or just take her off the schedule until after she has a baby. And my mom looked at him, and she's like, it's unremarkable that she's working and pregnant. It doesn't make any sense. There's no good reason to do this. And she said, look, you and whatever customer you're talking to just need to get over it. I don't know what to tell you. Did I mention she was blunt? So the owner said, well, if you won't do it, I will. And at that, my mom reached into her purse and she pulled out this massive key for the restaurant, for all the doors and the office and everything. And she put it on the desk in front of her and walked out. Now I was concerned. She was my ride home. No, I was concerned. As a kid, I was concerned because I didn't know what this meant. I mean, it was just the 2 of us. I didn't know what this meant for our family. But my mom was willing to take a stand. She was willing to say, this isn't right. And if this is how it's going to be, I won't stay. About an hour later, the owner came to his senses, called my mom at home, and said, I want you to come back. You can manage the schedule, the hostesses, however you want. It's up to you. And so she came back. Eve worked all the way up to her due date. She had 2 other children working there, and it was wholly unremarkable, just like my mom thought. So my mom caused a lot of ripples with that. My mom caused a lot of ripples in the restaurant, but good ones, right? She changed the way people thought about things. She changed the way the owner thought about the situation too, because he supported her and he recognized that this was the right thing to do, was to not discriminate against her because she was pregnant. So this is something I think about a lot because I'm somewhat embarrassed to admit that those lessons came from 30 years ago, right? So I often think about, from where I am in the community, have things changed today? Well, earlier this summer, I was on a panel at ChiWitCon. And it was a panel on hiring elite engineering talent in Chicago. Do you notice anything about this panel? Anything at all? There were 5 panelists. There was 1 moderator. There were no women. We're talking about hiring elite engineering talent in tech in Chicago, and there are no women on the panel. So yes, as the meme of the day goes, congratulations, you have an all-male panel. So here's where I'll give you my second confession. So I asked to give this talk, and I asked to give this talk because I'm committed to diversity. I'm committed to it because I know it makes our team better. I'm committed to it because I know it's the right thing to do. But there's another reason. I do it for her. My mom gave me life, but she gave me another really incredible gift. And that was the ability to see the world differently than what it was. And to see the world better than what it was. And that's her legacy. And that's the gift I keep with me all the time. But I have one last confession to give you. So this talk really isn't about my mom either. It's actually about all of you. You came today, you took a day from work, you took a day from school, you took a day away from your families to gather together and talk about Chicago, tech community, women in tech in Chicago, and how we can make that better. You took time out to do that. Mother Teresa worked her entire life in India, and mostly with poor women, including poor single mothers. And she said that I alone cannot change the world, but I can cast a stone across the waters and create many ripples. Let's go make some waves together. Thank you.
Given that you're committed to inclusion and diversity, what do you find are the challenges in making sure that your teams are in fact inclusive, and the differences in managing different cultures and different genders, right? Because it doesn't just require managing that individual, but managing the cohesion of the team as a whole.
Sure, yeah, in terms of hiring, there's a lot that we try to do both within the community and as a company to do that. So obviously, Nova has been very supportive of things that happen in the community with ARA, things we do through ITA to bring more women into the community, because that is an industry problem. There's just not enough women in the community. Going through the hiring process, we've worked very, very hard in the last 2 years to ferret out any bias in our hiring process. So we've looked at all of our job descriptions to make sure they don't have gendered language. There's actually apps online you can use to do that. We've looked at our interview lineups because we've noticed in the past, just like my Tech Week panel, we've had interview lineups where we have a female engineering candidate come in and the entire interviewing panel is men. So we've made changes like that. I think in terms of the team, a lot of it is first just respecting the differences of approach and opinion. We try to reinforce that through the entire team and through the leadership, but we've also taken the time. In fact, one of the things WIT has done at Nova is actually talk to all the women on the team and ask what's working and what's not, and we make adjustments for that. So it's an ongoing thing, but credit to our team in that everybody really embraces the idea of diversity, and that it is a team of lots of different backgrounds and just perspectives, and that's a good thing.
Hello.
Hi there.
So I had a question. So we launched very recently a inclusion and diversity initiative, and right now we're kind of building support and getting buy-in. It's a male-dominated company, obviously, and all the executives are men. And I guess my question is, as a man, what are the sort of messages when we're kind of presenting this? It's a small window, you've got a deck, and you want to get them interested. What do you think resonates the most with a male audience when you're talking about, advancing women within technology and also into leadership roles?
Sure, yeah, so I joke with people that depending on where you're coming at the question from, I can give you one of 3 different arguments about diversity. So, if you're motivated by the do good line, I'll tell you that it's doing good. If you're motivated by something else like business results, I'll tell you that all of us are in a hyper-competitive battle for talent, right? So And we have a diversity council at Nova, and we had a session on Monday, and I actually spoke at the beginning of that. One of the things I mentioned was that in the Apollo space program, we always talk about the male astronauts, but we never talk about the women who actually wrote the code to put the lander on the moon and did all the calculations to get them into orbit. And if we're fighting for talent, why are we focusing on this narrow segment of the industry? So that resonates. It's like you want to fill your roles, you want to get a better team, you want to have stronger, more talented technical people on your team. This is a good way to do it because we're not talking to this group of people. We're not getting them in, and we're not moving them through the ranks. So I think I think both of those two things are true, and it just depends on where they're coming from. There's a very real bottom line, like benefit to business argument to be made about diversity.
Hi, I'm Heather from Narrative Science, and we are also tackling diversity, equity, and inclusiveness at Narrative Science right now. I'm wondering about the networks for building allyship within executives who are predominantly white males. Do those exist in Chicago? How do you recommend bringing those to the forefront if they do exist?
Building a network of
Allies.
executives.
Yep, of executive allies. So thinking, hey, I not only recognize that this is valuable, but if I put my name behind it, then I can help further the cause and help other companies get there too.
Yeah, I think it exists as an outgrowth of a couple of different, there's no one organization in the community that does this. But I know organizations like ITA and other organizations that 1871 and some of this have helped promote it. I would tell you two things. So one, there's an organization here in ARA that does a really good job of connecting with people across the community, including male leaders in the community. They'd be a good resource for that. The other commitment I will make to you is if your leadership, and I know Adam, but if your leadership or other leaders that you have want to know why diversity or how to get started or how to support a women's networking group internally, feel free to give me a call. I'd be happy to have coffee with them and talk about our journey and help them get started.
We have 2 questions.
Yep.
Okay, as someone who cares about diversity and inclusion in your tech sort of department, I wonder how you sort of encourage that at all levels of management, because I think it's very important for managers to support diversity initiatives and also support their team members who want to be involved in things like that and pushing the agenda forward. But I often see a disconnect between we claim it has business value, but we don't reflect this on people's performance reviews, or we don't reflect this on, we don't actually make it an incentive to invest. So can you speak to some maybe things that you've done in your organization to help push that envelope?
Sure. Well, one thing we did this year is diversity is actually a goal. So we have 6 goals that we do across the tech team that every single person in this 200-person tech team is committed to for the year, and diversity is one of those 6. And that's so everyone is evaluated on their ability to help make the team more diverse, help us through the hiring process, and help make the team stronger. So I think that's one way. I think you have to talk about it, but I think you have to walk the talk too. I think as a leader, you have to not just say it, but like reinforce the message. Like talk about like if you see 10 candidates in a row for a position and there are no women coming through, you have to ask that question. If women aren't getting some of the same opportunities that men are on the team for promotion or advancement, you have to ask that question too. And I think every layer of management has to talk about that. There's another. Oh.
Yeah, this actually kind of piggybacks on that. Is as an executive, I think a lot of women in this room have had direct managers who either have conscious or unconscious biases and don't give the same opportunities or think of their female reports in the same light as they do their male counterparts. If you, as an executive, if you had a woman on your team whose direct manager was not giving her those opportunities, or even worse, taking credit for some of the work that they're doing, how would you want them to navigate that water? Do you want formality? Do you want it to be a very open conversation? Do you want them to find an ally? Do you want them to be direct with their manager? I think it takes a little bit of negotiation and finesse that I think some of us don't necessarily always know how to handle.
Yeah, it's tough. I would tell you some of it's cultural too. I mean, if you have a culture, and I know ours is, where it's open and, I think people are willing to express concerns, whether it's to their direct manager, to the people above, or to the people on talent team. I think they have that. I would, in general, I would say, first try to talk to your manager. If you're not, and we say this internally, if you don't feel like you're being heard, there are other people you can talk to, and talk to without fear of retribution or being looked at negatively. Because if you're really not getting a fair shake, then you have to have vehicles. And I should say for other companies, you have to create that. And again, it's walking the talk. You have to say, we're going to do this, and if people have concerns, we're going to have vehicles for them to express those concerns, and then we'll deal with them. Well,